Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. So today, obviously, GGD are back at work on 3.17, and I wanted to put in some feedback on one of the character archetypes that I think needs a little bit of help in 3.17. And this is bow attack characters, but not specifically damage over time bow characters like Toxic Rain and Caustic Arrow. I think they're fine. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me to see Toxic Rain take a couple of percentage points of nerfs. But the builds that really need attention are the builds that do instant damage with bows. So this is whether it be a skill like Split Arrow, Scourge Arrow, Lightning Arrow, Ice Shot, all those sorts of skills where you fire off an arrow and it deals its damage in a front-loaded hit. Maybe it also ignites the enemy, but you're not trying to scale the ignite, you're just doing the instant damage and any ignite's a bonus. So these skills are in a terrible place at low gear level, and I think this is a real problem because they're one of the things that someone that's brand new to Path of Exile will think of. So there's a bunch of builds that players that are familiar with Path of Exile will know. You don't attempt this until you've got a couple of hundred exalts behind you. A good example of this would be an Eternity Shroud build, but the thing is that no one that's brand new to Path of Exile is going to think of, trying an Eternity Shroud build. Maybe they'll get the item dropped for them once they become a veteran, and then they'll be like, hey, I wonder what I can do with this. But until that point, they're not going to be thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. So I don't think it's a problem that Eternity Shroud builds are terrible at low gear level. But a skill like Lightning Arrow or Ice Shot strikes you as something that should be doable, or should be playable and reasonably solid at all sorts of gear levels. I think the core problem here is that bow attack characters have to invest far too much into additional arrows, and that's what I've got a couple of suggestions as to how to fix. And also that those extra arrows come online far too late. So firstly, let's talk itemization and bow skills. And these items that you see on the screen here are two actual items that are being listed for mirror service in the Scourge League. Leave aside whether they're worth spending a mirror on or not. Even if they're not, people are entitled to list them for mirror service. This should give you a sense as to what a really, really good Toxic Rain bow looks like. In both cases, +1 to the level of socketed gems, +2 to the level of socketed bow gems, some high tier of chaos damage over time multiplier, some high tier of universal damage over time multiplier, and then filled out with other mods. And I think Plague Breeze is by far the stronger of these bows, but they're both very, very, very strong. Now, the reason that I think there's no fundamental problem with itemization for these sorts of bows is that it is really easy to roll something that's good enough to use, but not as good as these bows. So for instance, whilst you're not going to get Plague Breeze easily at all, and this item may very well be justified being listed as a mirror service item, getting just 3 of the mods on it is very doable. So +1 to the level of all socketed gems, +2 to the level of socketed bow gems, and 13% increased attack speed is something that you can get for yourself on a budget of maybe 70 or 80 chaos in the middle of a league. And until you can afford that, you can get something even, something that's a little bit worse than that, like just +2 to the level of bow gems and a reasonable tier of attack speed. So you've got great gear that's available for you, and then you've got some luxury upgrades available on top of that. However, the problem with instant attack speed, with instant bow attack builds, is that their jumps are much bigger, and the mandatory mods are much rarer. So let's talk about bow hit skills like Lightning Arrow and Ice Shot. They're seeing some use in the Scourge League, and actually I think that this can mislead people into thinking that there's no fundamental problem with them. This is because they're really good on Magic Find builds. High end power is fine on these builds. If you invest massively into a Lightning Shot build, you can make something that is an absolute monstrosity, and again, that can make it look like they're doing better than they actually are. The low end is derisory though. So the first problem is that stat stacking is so much better than any other way of scaling your damage on these builds. This comes online very late in progression and can't really be done until you can afford a few Awakener Orbs as a bare minimum to start stat stacking. But let's talk the main issue though, and that is damage projection. So a lot of power for bows is tied up in the mod of many. This is a suffix that comes online only at item level 86, and it's 10 times rarer than most suffixes at a weighting of 10. There's also a number of corruptions with similar effects, but of many grants 2 additional arrows to attacks that are made with this weapon. Until you get effects like this, and there is a lower tier version called of Splintering, which I think comes online at level 68, maybe it's level 75, +1 arrow, and it is normal rarity for a suffix. Bow builds usually have to rely upon dedicating an at least 1 and maybe 2 support gems to damage projection. So let's contrast 2 different skills here. On the one hand, we'll take Ice Trap. Ice Trap is a skill that has a built-in fairly good amount of damage projection because it just hits a large area of the screen. When the Ice Trap goes off, it has a significant AoE. So the investment in damage projection that an Ice Trap character makes, part of it will be using supports like Swift Assembly that cause them to throw more traps. Well, that actually increases the damage that they're doing. So they're not balancing off damage projection versus damage output. Additionally, they may invest some passive points into area of effect specifically. But passive points, whilst they're a significant investment, they're not a massive, massive one. On the contrast, if you are playing Ice Shot, you are going to need to invest an entire support gem slot on Greater Multiple Projectiles. Greater Multiple Projectiles has about half of the damage of a damage support because GMP has a reduction in, or a less multiplier to your damage, whereas a damage support like Elemental Damage with attack support that might be competing for that slot, that would have added damage instead. So that roughly, the fact that you are required to use GMP roughly halves the damage that you're going to be doing. This then causes further problems as well. Not only are you dealing less damage per second, but you're also freezing less frequently, which hampers your ability to proliferate damage through Herald of Ice. And as a result, I think that the goal should be that Greater Multiple Projectiles is a support gem that you use early, then you outgrow, and that various itemization on bows should be changed to make that the case. So a player will start their league with Greater Multiple Projectiles as a support, and then as they get better gear, they'll reasonably quickly get rid of GMP. Maybe by the time they hit level 80, maybe by the time they hit level 85 or so, they get rid of GMP, and they're like, you know what? That was something I grew out of, just like I grew out of the Gold Room that I got in Act 3. So my proposed solution: firstly, nuke the cold damage per 10 dex mods from orbit. This is essential because the rest of this package of changes is going to be a buff, and if you don't do this, then the only build that will be playable next league will be the stat stacking dexterity bow builds. So I suggest nerfing them to per 12 to 18 dex, with Divine Orbs re-rolling that roll range, and just seeing how that plays for a league. If it ends up actually killing the entire build, then bring it in next league and make it 11 to 15 or something like that. If it ends up that they're still dominant, then you can reassess again. I think that'd be fine though. And then the big thing is that you want to add far better versions of the bow damage projection modifiers. So this is the item mods that add damage projection to bows, plus arrows, plus chain, and plus fork. Add more of them and add them at lower level, and add better versions at the top end. So my suggestion is in the core mod pool, change +1 arrow to item level 50. Change +2 arrows to item level 68. Add +3 at item level 80, and add +4 as an endgame only chase mod at item level 86. Make the +1, 2, and 3 mods very common. So I'm proposing 3,000 weight each here, which would make getting one of these rolls about as common as getting one of the attack speed rolls on a bow. Obviously getting the one you most want is going to be rarer, but you will usually see one of these once you start getting to late in the acts. Whenever you identify a bow, it will probably have one of these mods on it. Then make the +4 one rare though, so that it's something that's an endgame luxury upgrade. Then add +1 and +2 arrows to the crafting bench with higher minimum levels. So I'm going to suggest 68 and 80 here, so basically the same as a whole tier higher. And I suggest denominating these in regals just because regals should be used more by the crafting bench. They're the rarest of the currency orbs that you can count on getting in some numbers. For the Crusader mod pool, I suggest dropping fork to item level 68 so that any Crusader bow can get it, and upgrading the weight so that it's no longer a chase roll. Then add fork twice as a genuinely chase mod at high item level, so item level 86. Then from the Crusader and Shaper pool, they both have chain, and chain is twice as common on a Shaper item because with the Crusader one, you've got both the chance of getting chain and the chance of getting fork. With the Shaper, you can only get chain. So for both the Crusader and Shaper pool, drop chain once to item level 68 and make it no longer rare, and then add chain twice as an item level 86 chase mod. So that can be quite rare. Most people will never see it, but some people will, and it becomes one of those luxury upgrades you can chase, just like fork twice or +4 arrows. then this set of package of changes is going to boost Barrage and Barrage support into the stratosphere. I don't think that's a good thing, and I think that they should be nerfed with bows only, so that these additional projectiles don't make them into absolutely dominant must-use effects. So I think that Barrage and Barrage support should just get some sort of bonus that only applies to wands, lower its base stats, and then give it a bonus that only applies when wielding one or more wands, so that Barrage ends up not being broken by these extra free projectiles people are getting. And then maybe consider making Chain and Fork the same mod group, but that takes playtesting. That's not something I can say for certain. So this is going to have a side effect of ruining a lot of unique bows. They're going to be pushed further behind rares because you're buffing rares that is equivalent to nerfing uniques. And I would address this with a few buffs here. For the lower minimum level items, just reduce their minimum level by 3. That'll make them still useful for longer. They'll still have a place. And then for the endgame bows, I suggest that the more common ones get +1 arrow given to them if they don't already have it. +2 arrows if they're if they're in the medium tiers of rarity, and then +3 or +4 on any that are boss drops or tier 1 rarity. So tier 1 rarity is the same rarity as Rizlatha's Coil. It's considerably rarer than Chevron's Wrappings or Mjolnir, so those items would be quite rare. And then I could get behind some of Slivertongue, Darkscorn, or Doomfletch Prism being made quite a bit better. I think it'd be fine to see these 3 items be made even somewhat uber if they're made tier 1 rarity uniques. Last note that needs to be said is that these changes would make Brittle too good. Brittle is the alternate cold ailment that causes monsters to be more easily able to have a critical hit inflicted on them. It's already ridiculously good right now, and it's probably one of the most likely things to get nerfed in 3.17. But I think that any buffs to bows need to be tested with Brittle, and if the combination of bow buffs and Brittle in its current form breaks the game, then it's Brittle that needs to pay the price for that. It is not the bows. Anyways, that's all I got on this. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, may your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you particularly when 3.17 hype season gets underway shortly.